So I've been waiting for this particular story to see if it would change the narrative, if the narrative would change somehow before I would go and comment on it. But the narrative has stayed exactly the same from news organization to news organization. And because it has stayed exactly the same, I've gotten a little suspicious. Um, I am not, I really don't agree with the current narrative, and I will explain in a minute exactly why. But I want to go ahead and read an article that I mean, every single news organization around the world has said almost word for word what is in this article. So this article is by Yohanan Visser on Israel Today. The title is Analysis: Why King Abdullah II Nixed Parts of the Jordan-Israeli Peace Deal. On Sunday, King Abdullah II dropped a bombshell when he announced that Jordan would not renew parts of the 24-year peace agreement with Israel. In a first statement, the king said that he had informed Israel, "We are putting an end to the application of the peace treaty annexes regarding Bakura and Gumar." And what are these annexes all about? Well, there are like around 1,000 acres of prime farmland, which Israel's leases from Jordan. And this was a part of the peace treaty between Israel and Jordan in the early 1990s. Okay. And I will continue to comment as we go. He was referring to the two parcels of Jordanian land in the north and south Israel. The northern part is right up there between the Yarmouk River and the Jordan River, just below the Sea of Galilee or Lake Kinneret. In other words, near the Golan Heights. Okay. This southern portion, I don't know where that's at. So, which was leased for a period of 25 years by Jerusalem under the peace treaty signed in November 1994 by Abdullah's father, King Hussein, and Israel's Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin, whose assassination was commemorated the same day Abdullah made his announcement. Abdullah II said he would not renew a lease agreement of the two parcels of land in the Arava Desert north of Eilat and the Jordan Valley close to the Sea of Galilee because of regional circumstances, and vowed to protect the interests of Jordan and the Jordanians. The decision took Israel by surprise, despite the fact that relations between the two countries were already deteriorating since July 2017, when Ziv Moyal, a Israeli security guard, killed two Jordanians in the compound of the Israel's embassy in Amman, and he did so protecting himself. And I want to add further that the deterioration of relations between Israel and Jordan has something to do with what I'm going to say either at the end of this particular article or towards the end. So keep that in mind as I'm reading here. One of the Jordanians tried to stab Moyal, who said he clearly acted in self-defense, but the Jordanian government nevertheless wanted to try him for murder. The incident triggered a diplomatic standoff, which only ended after Jordan received an official Israeli memorandum in which the government in Jerusalem apologized for the death of the two Jordanians, as well as for the death of a Jordanian judge who was killed in another incident in 2014. In recent months, King Abdullah faced increased pressure to cancel the whole peace agreement between Israel and Jordan. The whole peace agreement with Israel over the country's treatment of Palestinian Arabs, and after the United States recognized Israeli sovereignty over all of Jerusalem and relocated the U.S. Embassy from Tel Aviv to Israel's capital. Now, in this current narrative, you will see the truth. You will see the real truth. But when we get toward the end, you will see what the narrative is trying to steer the public eye away from the truth. I will get to that in just a minute. The truth is right here that they are that the Jordanian people, the Arabs, are angrier and angrier and angrier with Israel, and it's their own fault. Several mass demonstrations, the latest last Saturday, were held in Jordanian cities during which protesters demanded the king would reassert Jordanian authority over the two leased parcels of land. About 80 Jordanian lawmakers later joined the popular protests and signed a letter urging Abdullah to cancel the peace agreement with Israel. So, what's really happening is the push is to cancel the whole peace agreement with Israel. And you will see what's happening. And it's happening slowly. There are several other reasons King Abdullah decided to cancel a part of the peace agreement with Israel. First of all, the protests in Jordan are not about Israel, but about the dire economic situation in the country and about the king himself, who is accused of being corrupt and addicted to gambling. During the mass demonstration in Amman on Saturday, demonstrators chanted slogans such as "No loyalty to anyone but Allah" and "The corrupt king must leave," and "We no longer waste time. Abdullah is the only one to blame." And in this article, you can find the video of them chanting those slogans. Earlier this year, Jordanian protesters took to the streets to demonstrate against the rising prices and a proposed hike in income tax, which were mandated by the International Monetary Fund as part of austerity measures. The demonstrations, which were instigated by the Jordanian branch of the Muslim Brotherhood, led to cosmetic changes in the Jordanian government, but not to a significant improvement in the economic situation. Secondly, King Abdullah II is currently adjusting Jordan's policies vis-a-vis Turkey and Syria, where dictator Bashar al-Assad has regained control over more than 2/3 of the country, including the Jordanian border. And we're getting closer to the narrative. In fact, this is where the narrative begins. The king is trying to mend ties with Assad, and earlier this month reopened the Nasi border crossing on the Syrian border despite opposition from the United States and Israel. The Jordanian government has a vested interest in the return of Syrian refugees who have aggravated the already dire economic situation in the country and will soon welcome a high-level Syrian delegation headed by Prime Minister Walid Muallim to discuss the refugee problem and changing regional situation. At the same time, Abdullah is talking with the Turkish government about a change in routing of Turkish exports to Jordan and the Arab Gulf states. These exports are currently routed via the Israeli port of Haifa. Abdullah II, however, wants Turkey to use the land route via Syria again and dispatch his prime minister, Omar al-Razaz, to Ankara to achieve this goal in talks with Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan. By not extending the lease agreement regarding the two Israeli enclaves in Jordan, Abdullah II is signaling he will sacrifice good relations with Israel on the altar of his new alignment with Turkey and Syria. Now, in this particular paragraph is where is the current narrative. But the problem is with this narrative, it is missing the elephant in the room. The elephant in the room is Russia. Okay? Those of you who have been following my videos know by now that Russia instigated the 67 war and the 73 war, both of them. It was Russia who instigated it, especially the war in 1967. So when you leave part of the truth out of the narrative becomes false. It's not accurate. So it should read, by not extending the lease agreement regarding the two Israeli enclaves in Jordan, Abdullah II is signaling he will sacrifice good relations with Israel on the altar of his new alignment with Turkey, Syria, and Russia. Now, this all starts to make sense now, doesn't it? At the same time, he knows that if his regime wants to survive, he needs to appease the Islamist hardliners in Jordan who are increasingly targeting the monarch's handling of Jordan's multiple problems. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has now vowed he will push for negotiations with Abdullah II in order to reinstate the lease agreement. And it looks like the king is not going for it. It says, in light of the regional circumstances, the Jordanian king was referring to chances are slim. However, the Israeli government will succeed to save the two important agricultural areas. Really? So the narrative also states that Jordan is abandoning or revoking portions of the treaty. You know as well as I do that, now I know what the treaty says, that one party, after the 25 years is 1 year from being over, that part, if one party wants to abandon that part of the treaty, they have got to give the other party a year's notice. Well, I know this is exactly what Jordan did. The problem is a treaty is a treaty. When you abandon part of it, you are actually abandoning all of it, regardless. So if the treaty allows for the abandonment of part of the treaty after 25 years, it's essentially abandoning the whole treaty. Let's look at this at face value. And we see here the reason why, because basically, in the eyes of Jordan, I say in the eyes of Jordan because the war is not near done yet. They just don't know that. But in the eyes of Jordan, Syria, with the help of Russia, has won the war. And so they want to realign themselves with whoever the winner was. And if the winner in their eyes was Bashar al Assad, then they want to realign with Bashar al Assad. Now, reading this article, why? There is even more intense hatred for Israel in Jordan now than there was a year ago or 2 years ago. Apparently, this generation of Jordanians have not learned from the mistakes of the past and are about to repeat them. What do I mean by that? Let's go to the 6 Day War, shall we? All right. Now, the Six-Day War, also known as the June War, 1967 Israeli-Arab War, or the Third Arab-Israeli War, was fought between the 5th and the 10th of June, 1967. And I might add, on the 7th of June, 1967, on Shavuot, Shlomo Goren, head general of the IDF at the time, made the call to rebuild Jerusalem as written in Daniel 9. But nobody knows this. Nobody cares because it's a very important call. You're supposed to count 7 sevens and apparently a jubilee from that time. But anyway, I digress. Was fought between the 5th and the 10th of June 1967 by Israel and the neighboring states of Egypt, Jordan, and Syria. You see how the players are familiar? Now, I'm going to read some of this and then I'm going to go back to the article on The Guardian. Every narrative always tries to exclude the Russians from this scenario, but the Russians are always an integral part of this war against Israel, or these wars against Israel. Relations between Israel and its neighbors had never fully normalized following the 1948 Israeli-Arab War. In 1956, Israel invaded the Egyptian Sinai with one of its objectives being to reopen the Straits of Tiran, which Egypt blocked to Israel shipping since 1950. Israel was subsequently forced to withdraw, but won a guarantee that the Straits of Tiran would remain open. While the United Nations Emergency Force was deployed along the border, there was no demilitarization agreement. In the period leading up to June 1967, tensions became dangerously heightened. Sound familiar? So, what we can deduce from what happened in 1967, when tensions become heightened, dangerously heightened, expect war. What do we see in Jordan? What do we see all around the Middle East? Tensions are becoming dangerously heightened between Israel and Israel's enemies. War usually is next, based upon what happened in 1967. All right. Israel reiterated its post-1956 position that the closure of the Straits of Tiran to its shipping would be a casus belli. It's a Latin expression meaning an act or event that provokes or is used to justify war. In May, Egypt President Gamal Abdel Nasser announced that the straits would be closed to Israel vessels and then mobilize its Egyptian forces along its border with Israel. Why did he do that? Because the Russians told him a lie. Why would the Russians tell Nasser a lie? Because they wanted a war. Russia wanted their proxies to wipe out Israel. Israel was the only thing standing in the way of the Russians having hegemony over the entire Middle East. To be truthful. On the 5th of June, Israel launched what it claimed was a series of preemptive airstrikes against Egyptian airfields. Claims and counterclaims relating to this series of events are one of a number of controversies regarding the conflict. The Egyptians were caught by surprise, and nearly the entire Egyptian Air Force was destroyed, with a few Israeli losses, giving the Israelis air supremacy. Simultaneously, the Israelis launched a ground offensive into the Gaza Strip and the Sinai, which again caught the Egyptians by surprise. After some initial resistance, Egyptian leader Gamal Abdel Nasser ordered the evacuation of the Sinai. Israeli forces rushed westward in pursuit of the Egyptians, inflicting heavy losses and conquering the Sinai. What happens next? Nasser induces Syria and Jordan to begin attacks on Israel by using the initially confused situation to claim that Egypt had repelled the Israeli airstrike. Israeli counterattacks resulted in the seizure of East Jerusalem as well as the Judea and Samaria from the Jordanians, while Israel's retaliation against Syria resulted in its occupation or the taking of the Golan Heights. Okay. You see what's going on now? You see, we're having a regrouping, a reorienting of the 67 war. Now, what I want to do is go back to this article on The Guardian. The title is How the Six-Day War Almost Led to Armageddon. Now, when we read this article, the narrative is corrected. You see, in the Wikipedia article, Russia was not even mentioned. But in this one, you get a little bit more truth, a little bit. New evidence of 1967 Soviet plan to invade Israel shows how close the world came to nuclear conflict. Now, folks, please read this. I don't have time to read the entire article. But this was the first words. The very first words on this article from The Guardian, How the Six-Day War Almost Led to Armageddon, is blamed on Russia or the Soviet Union. Now, let's see if I can find the article about how the Russians, let's see. Now, so if you go and type in Google Soviet Union and the Israeli or Arab-Israel conflict, the narrative on the Wikipedia changes. And on the very top of it, it says the Soviet Union played a significant role in the Arab-Israeli conflict, as the conflict was a major part of the Cold War. For related developments after the dissolution of the Soviet Union in 1991, see Russia and the Israeli-Arab conflict. So maybe I will go to that. Now, for related developments after the dissolution of the Soviet Union, no. All right, so I will stay with this one. Let's see if I can find, okay, Six-Day War. Here we go. The Six-Day War portion. Although the Soviet Union had adopted a foreign policy of détente, easing of hostility in the mid-1960s, it played a key role in the instigation of the Six-Day War in Israel. Soviet Union pursued détente because of the need for economic stability in order to create domestic change. Furthermore, as stated in Brezhnev's foreign policy speech given the Central Committee in December 1966, a key goal of the Soviet foreign policy was the consolidation of the post-World War II borders. It was believed that the Soviet Union should be cautious in its foreign engagement in an attempt to prevent any political instability from reaching Europe. In the 1950s, the Soviet Union became allies with Egypt and Syria due to the Anglo-French debacle at the Suez and the Arab-Israeli conflict and the use of the Soviet ruble. Later, Egypt and Syria developed a defense treaty in which, if one of them declared war on Israel, the other one would get involved as well. Soviet relations with Israel had declined since Israel's declaration of independence in 1948, when Levi Eshkol became the prime minister in 1963. Moscow was nervous because they weren't sure what direction Eshkol would take in his foreign policy, specifically Soviet-Israel relations. Initially, things seemed to be going better, with representatives from Soviet and Israeli governments meeting in June 1965 and January 1966. However, the relation soon fell apart. On February the 23rd, 1966, Syria had a military coup in which the new regime, Neo Ba'ath, took a more radical position towards Israel. This is the same party that's in power in Syria right now. Took a more radical position towards Israel, both in rhetoric and action, supporting Palestinian guerrilla activity against Israel. Disagreements about Israel led to the development of tensions in the Soviet-Syrian relationship, eventually leading the Soviets delaying their arms shipments to Syria and slowing down on the previous promised Euphrates Dam loan. In the 1960s, there were numerous clashes between the Syrians and Israelis on the Israeli-Syrian border. In October 1966, Palestinian guerrilla operation against Israel intensified. One of the most serious of these incidents occurred in April 7, 1967, when Israel destroyed 7 of Syria's modern Russian MiG planes. Although the Soviets provided the Syrian army with weapons, they made it clear they wanted to avoid war. After several more Palestinian guerrilla operations, Soviet Foreign Ministry adopted a two-pronged approach, demanding that Israel stop its aggressive policy, when clearly it was the Arabs who were aggressive, towards the Arab countries, and telling Iraq, Jordan, and Syria that a warning had been sent out and explained that the Soviet government disapproved of any Chinese involvement in the Middle East and the actions of the Palestinian guerrilla organizations. As tension between Israel and Syria increased, Israel felt the threat of force was the only deterrent left. On May 12th, the Politburo was told that the IDF had formulated a large-scale attack on Syria and was simply waiting for a good time to begin it. So, a false narrative arrived in the Politburo in Russia, you see. You know, it was a propaganda campaign to try to do something to Israel. A day later, on May the 13th, 1967, the Soviets gave the Egyptian president Gamal Abdel Nasser an intelligence report that claimed there were Israeli troops gathering on the Syrian border. Dmitry Chuvakin, Soviet ambassador to Israel, refused an Israeli invitation to visit the border in order to disprove the report. So, what we have here was a false narrative created by the Soviet Union about Israel, and Israel invited the ambassador to come over. Let's prove that it's false. But they wouldn't come and look at the evidence, you see, because that would interfere with the current narrative. Now, I hope I haven't lost my place. On May 14th, Nasser sent his chief of staff, General Mohammad Fawzi, to the border to investigate the report. and was told there were no Israeli troop concentrations. Although Nasser knew that the Soviet report was wrong, he perhaps interpreted to indicate Soviet support for an Egyptian offensive towards Israel. You see how this stuff happens? On May 15th, Nasser sent the Egyptian army to Sinai, and on May 18th, 1967, Nasser requested that the UN emergency force withdraw from Egypt. Furthermore, on May the 22nd, he closed Tiran Straits to Israeli ships. And of course, how is Israel supposed to interpret it? You have the Russians making false accusations against Israel. Israel knows that Russia is trying to use their what they call, 3D chess, to manipulate the Arabs into war against Israel to do their dirty work. The Israelis interpreted the closing of the Straits of Tiran as an act of war and attacked Egypt on June the 5th, 1967, destroying hundreds of airplanes. Russia reacted to Israel's offensive in two ways. First, it severed diplomatic relations with Israel and threatened sanctions, and fighting with Syria did not cease immediately. Secondly, it told the White House that unless Israel stopped military operations, the Soviet Union would get involved. In the following 6 days, Israel achieved massive victories until the war ended in June 10, 1967, with a ceasefire. The role of the USSR played in the June 1967 war between the State of Israel and the surrounding Arab countries remained fiercely debated. Some scholars have argued that Moscow started the war in order to further its position in the area and increase Arab reliance on Soviet aid. Expanding on the notion that a key goal of the Soviet Union in the Middle East in the 1960s was to expand its military presence through the procurement of both naval and air bases. Furthermore, the Soviets chose to involve Egypt in the conflict due to the fear that an incident between Syria and Israel would likely lead to Syria's defeat. I don't need to go any further here, folks. What I'm trying to convey to you is the current narrative has Russia excluded from this situation in Jordan. I will tell you, Russia is the elephant in the room, the gorilla in the sandbox. And we, as I keep saying, we have the 67 war about to repeat itself. Jordan will always remain aligned with Syria. If there is a war between Syria and Israel, Jordan will surely get involved, which is why Zechariah 14 takes place. Who is it that's going to come and invade East Jerusalem, as Zechariah 14 states? It's Jordan. And when you read about, we'll go to Zechariah 14. You must remember that I'll just start reading. You must remember that in those days, it wasn't called Jordan. It was called Ammon, Moab, and Edom. On the other side of the Euphrates, on the other side of the Jordan River. Behold, the day of Jehovah's wrath comes, and your spoil shall be divided in the midst of you, for I will gather Goi. It doesn't say all nations. See, it doesn't mean many nations won't be involved. But when you put in all nations, when it says Goe, you're slanting the narrative, you're slanting the truth. Against Jerusalem to battle, and the city shall be taken, and the houses rifled, and the women raped, and the half of the city shall be deported, shall be driven out. That's the Jews. What half? East Jerusalem. Why? Because of a war that takes place by the nations round about. But somebody is behind them. Ezekiel 38 and 39 points out who's behind them. And the rest of the people will not be cut off from the city. That's the Arabs will not be cut off from the city. And then Jehovah shall go forth and fight against Goe, as when he fought in the day of battle. What battle? In the battle of Jehoshaphat. What battle was the battle of Jehoshaphat? It was Ammon, Moab, and Edom. Mount Seir. You need to go look it up. So it's very, very clear that that battle is between Ammon, Moab, and Seir. Today would be Jordan. This one particular battle in a larger war. And his feet shall stand on that day in the Mount of Olives, which is before Jerusalem on the east side. And the Mount of Olives shall cleave in the midst thereof toward the east and toward the west. And there will be a great valley, half the mountain shall remove from the north, and half of it toward the south. And you shall flee to the valley of the mountains, for the valley of the mountains shall reach unto Azel. Yes, you shall flee as you fled before the earthquake in the days of Uzziah, king of Yehudah. And Jehovah my Elohim shall come, and with all of this is the time of the seventh trumpet, when the trumpet shall sound, and the dead shall be raised, and all Israel gathered back into the Holy Land from the north, south, east, and west. Okay? Says, and Jehovah will be king over all of the earth in those days. Right? Now, and it talks about the plague. Verse 12, and this shall be the plague wherewith Jehovah will smite the folk that fought against Jerusalem. Who has fought against Jerusalem? Russia, Syria, Iraq, Jordan, Egypt, Lebanon, the Philistines. Their flesh shall consume away while they stand on their feet, and shall consume away in their holes, and their tongue shall consume away in their mouth. Shall come to pass in that day that a great tumult from Jehovah shall be among them, and they shall lay hold every one on the hand of his neighbor, and his hand shall rise up against the hand of his neighbor. That's just like what happened in the valley of Jehoshaphat. But Ezekiel 38 mentions Gomer, which today is in Turkey. It mentions other nations too, which are mostly up north. But then Isaiah 60 mentions other nations. The tumultuous people in the Mediterranean Sea, in the coastlands of the Mediterranean Sea, aka the boot of Rome, the ones who made war against Jerusalem in 67 through 70 AD. So guess what? See, it doesn't, okay, it says, And this shall be the plague wherewith Jehovah will smite all the people that have fought against Jerusalem. Does it say that fought against Jerusalem in the last days? No, it doesn't say that. Every single nation who ever fought against Jerusalem is going to receive this plague. Every one of them. Every single one of them. So Europe is going to get it. Why? How many times have the Crusaders come to Jerusalem to try to take it? Since 67 AD. Think about it. What a horrible plague. And we had discussed it looks like the plague might be nuclear warfare. I said might be. Because it says, it shall come to pass that a great tumult from Jehovah shall be among them, and they shall lay hold every one on the hand of his neighbor, and his hand shall rise up against the hand of his neighbor. So this is in the same context as where there shall be a plague, wherewith Jehovah will smite all the people that have fought against Jerusalem. They're going to kill each other with a plague. Whether they will rot while they're standing. And they will do it to each other, is what it says. Sounds like nuclear warfare to me. Anyway, and then it shall come to pass in verse 16 that anyone that is left of all of the nations which came against Jerusalem. This is not just the ones round about. Now, the ones round about are talked about in the last invasion. But every single nation who ever came against Jerusalem, every single nationality that ever came against Jerusalem are going to have to come to Jerusalem every year to keep the Feast of Tabernacles. And anyone who doesn't says, and they to worship Jehovah of hosts and to keep the Feast of Tabernacles, and it shall be that whoso does not come up of all the families of the earth unto Jerusalem. Now we're saying all the families of the earth, which proves my point. That nearly every single nation that the earth has ever known has participated in a war against Jerusalem at one time or another. Every single nationality. And it shall come to pass that those who will not come of all the families of the earth unto Jerusalem to worship the King, Jehovah of hosts, even upon them shall be no rain. And if the family of Egypt go not up and come not, then, because they don't have much rain to begin with, there shall be the plague wherewith Jehovah will smite the heathen that come not up to keep the Feast of Tabernacles. This shall be the punishment of Egypt and the punishment of all the nations that come not to keep the Feast of Tabernacles. The plague. A blow, a slaughter, a plague, a pestilence. The word is Magepha. 4046 in Hebrew. So, if you cannot see the handwriting on the wall, it distresses me that they did not include Russia in the current narrative, because it's like an ostrich sticking its head in the sand when danger is approaching, which is why the Ezekiel 38 and 39 is there for all of us to see as a warning where it's coming from.